Section 11 of Music by Ursula Creighton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11, Bach and Handel. In 1685, 10 years before Purcell died, Johann Sebastian Bach was born at Eisenach in Germany. Every great musician since Bach lived reveres his name and has found inspiration in his music. No musician since he lived has been too great to learn from Bach. His music is not always easy to listen to or to understand, particularly at a first hearing, but it is so full of meaning that the more we hear his works, the more beauties we find in them, and the more we feel we are experiencing new emotions and new thoughts. Johann Sebastian Bach was one of a large family of the same name, famous for their music for over 100 years. He had uncles and cousins who were well-known musicians, and his father was a violinist and a town musician. In those days, every German town had a band of trained musicians, so that the young Bach heard much instrumental music. He learned from his father to play the violin, but when he was 10 years old his parents died, and he went to live with an older brother and entered a school where he became well known for his beautiful boy's voice. Schoolboys in those days used to sing regularly, not only in school but in the streets, in front of people's houses, and in this way Bach learned a great deal of vocal music. It is said that so anxious was he to learn all he could that he would sit up on moonlit nights copying from a book of organ music which his brother possessed but would not allow him to use. After he left his brother's house, he supported himself by his singing. He went long journeys on foot to Hamburg to hear Reinken the organist play. He had to save up money to provide enough food for these journeys, and once, when he was on his way home, very hungry and with no food or money, he sat down outside an inn for a rest, when a window opened and 2 herrings' heads were thrown out. Bach picked them up and found in each a piece of gold. Full of joy at this gift, he at once abandoned his homeward way and went back to Hamburg, where he was able to listen again to the organ music he was so devoted to. In other countries, it had not been the custom for the congregation to join in the singing in church, but in Germany, the people had always been great hymn singers, and when Luther reformed the service, he, being devoted to music, collected the old German hymns and adapted and arranged good tunes from many sources to fit them. These chorales, as they were called, became a regular part of the Protestant service, and a great inspiration to German musicians. They used the tunes to make pieces for the organ, adding other parts on the instrument in counterpoint, just as old writers of polyphonic music had written parts for voices. Luther once wrote a preface to a musical book and gave a beautiful description of such music. He said, "When natural music is heightened and polished by art, then man first beholds, and can with great wonder examine to a certain extent, for it cannot be wholly seized or understood, the great and perfect wisdom of God in his marvelous work of music, in which this is most singular and indeed astonishing, that one man sings a simple tune, or tenor, as musicians call it, together with which 3, 4, or 5 voices also sing, which as it were play and skip delightedly round this simple tune or tenor, and wonderfully grace and adorn the said tune with manifold devices and sounds, performing as it were a heavenly dance, so that those who at all understand it and are moved by it must be greatly amazed and believe that there is nothing more extraordinary in the world than such a song adorned with many voices." This description of the old polyphonic music for voices is equally apt for the contrapuntal music musicians now wrote round choral tunes, only the music, being for instruments, was more free and could move about more. These pieces written on the hymn or choral tunes were called choral preludes or fantasias, and the ones written by Bach are some of the most intimate and lovely of his compositions. The greatest works, however, that he wrote for the organ were fugues, pieces written for several parts or voices, as they are often called. Each voice plays or sings the special short phrase or melody which is the subject of the fugue. One voice starts alone and sings the subject. Then another voice begins to sing the same subject, while the first voice accompanies. Then the third voice enters and sings the subject while the two first voices accompany, and the same continues until as many voices are singing as the particular fugue is written for. The subject keeps occurring frequently through the piece, sometimes in one part, sometimes another, sometimes in different keys, and always with the other voices weaving different melodies or counterpoints round it, and at times making wonderful passages of music without the subject, as a contrast to it. Fugues were usually full of clever tricks and devices. The subject was made to combine with itself in different parts, starting a few notes later, or written in notes of greater or shorter length, and the counterpoints were so cleverly written that they could be used above or below the subject. Such complexities were very difficult to achieve in a smooth and musical manner. But the wonder about Bach's fugues is that though he shows in some of them that he can do all these skillful devices with great ease, it is not this skill that is the interest of his music. To the ordinary musician, it was enough to write a fugue as an exercise, to show his cleverness in managing notes. But for Bach, composition was so much a part of his nature that he wrote to express all sorts of different emotions, and each of his fugues is a perfect piece of music. Almost all great musicians have written fugues, but no one has ever written them as Bach did, with such mastery, such feeling, and in such numbers. His organ fugues are some of the most perfect music that has ever been written for the organ, and modern organists still play them as the most important works for their instrument. Toccatas are another kind of piece which Bach often wrote for the organ. These are pieces which contain many different effects, sometimes brilliant, sometimes quiet, all showing off the powers of the instrument. Toccatas were sometimes very showy pieces, but in Bach's hands, though he made most brilliant ones, they are full of music, and sometimes, after wonderfully brilliant passages, making sounds and rhythms such as he alone knew how to create, there will come a soft, tender passage, all the more beautiful for the contrast with what has gone before. For the harpsichord and clavichord, Bach wrote pieces such as fugues and toccatas, also two beautiful sets of preludes and fugues called the Well-Tempered Clavier. Pianos had just been invented when Bach lived, and he played on some at various times. But though he admired the tone, he objected to the heavy action of the notes, and remained always faithful to the quiet, gentle sounds of the clavichord. The famous Well-Tempered Clavier consists of 48 preludes and fugues, which are still some of the most beautiful piano music in the world, for they are played on the piano, as clavichords are now seldom used. They show us one more interesting thing about Bach, which was that he realized that the way notes were usually tuned in his time was not the way that would then best help the advancement of music. In Bach's day, keyed instruments like organs and harpsichords had their notes absolutely in tune. That is to say, the notes of a few scales were tuned to exact proportions of the key or fundamental note. But this meant that music written in any other keys than the 2 or 3 usually used was dreadfully out of tune. The notes were so perfectly tuned for the few keys that they could not relate themselves to more distant keys. And though some good musicians could not restrict themselves to the few usual keys, but insisted on being free to use more strange and unusual keys, the noise produced must have been beautiful only in their imagination, for the notes used were most discordant to the ordinary ear. However, it had been shown that it was possible to alter the tuning of keys in such a way that every key or scale was equally in tune, and Bach's preludes and fugues were all written for this novel system of tuning and in every different key. For it was not only composition that interested Bach. His mind worked on everything connected with music. He made, for instance, a great change in playing by using the thumb. This had hardly ever been done before, and the way we now play our pianos and organs, using all our fingers and thumbs, is due to Bach's innovation. As time went on, Bach held appointments not only as organist, but as director of music, and wherever he was, he wrote music according to his opportunities. Frederick the Great admired him sincerely, and often tried to get Bach to visit him. Bach, however, liked a regular life, and would not go for a long time. But when at last he did arrive and the news was brought to Frederick, his excitement was so great that he had the famous musician brought to him at once, without even allowing him time to change his clothes. When he was organist, he wrote pieces for the organ and cantatas for voices. These were works more like our modern anthems, with solos and chorus, and usually accompanied by instruments such as violins, oboes, etc. When he was director of music at Creighton and had the opportunity of hearing violin and other instrumental music, he wrote his famous suites for violin and cello, which are still the greatest music for those instruments, and also his beautiful concertos, still some of the most lovely music for orchestra we possess, though unlike modern orchestral music. These concertos are what we should call symphonies. That is, they are pieces for an orchestra of different instruments playing together. Strings, that is, violins, violas, cellos, and double basses. Wind, such as flutes, oboes, trumpets, and piano, or cembalo, as the harpsichord then used was called. By concerto, we now mean a piece with a solo instrument and orchestral accompaniment, and some of Bach's famous concertos have several solo instruments as well as orchestral accompaniment, and so are properly to be called concertos. Whereas in modern concertos, the solo instrument sounds prominent against the orchestral accompaniment, in Bach's concertos, each solo instrument is only part of the beautiful counterpoint, and the contrast lies not in one instrument against the orchestra, but in the large group of instruments that plays the orchestral part and the few that play the solo part. The last appointment Bach held was that of cantor at the Thomasschule in Leipzig. Here he had to teach the boys and to compose and play and direct, and in Leipzig he spent the last 27 years of his life. Here he wrote much more church music, his famous B minor Mass, and one of his greatest works, the Matthew Passion. That is a setting to music of the story of the Passion from the Gospel of St. Matthew. Other great composers had written such settings, but Bach's is always considered the most perfect. To people unaccustomed to Bach's music, it is not always easy to listen to at first, for the contrapuntal melodies are not obviously tuneful, and the music is not always direct and simple, but rather reflecting the mood of resignation or joy of the singer. And the voice parts are not necessarily easy and smooth for the voice. They are rather like a voice singing in the manner of an instrument, making part of the weaving counterpoint. All these things seem at first strange. The beauties are so delicate, so easily lost upon us. But everyone enjoys the old German hymn tunes, the chorales, which are scattered through the work, with the magic harmonies Bach has given them. Combinations of sounds so unexpected, so stirring, that even now they seem new and surprisingly beautiful, while in Bach's day, the consistory of one town actually complained that his harmonies were too strange and ought to be more simple. One other quality in Bach's music which everyone enjoys is his wonderful rhythm. Bach in some ways brought instrumental music to perfection, and one great force in instrumental music is rhythm. When we hear one of his great fugues, the insistent rhythm and the gradually piled up sound of part upon part seem to build up the sound as if it were a piece of architecture. It is his rhythms which give Bach's work such wonderful force and vitality. There is so much of Bach's music that it is difficult for any one person to know it all unless after years of study. Musical instruments were not all very perfect in Bach's day, but for those that were, the organ, the violin, and the clavier, he wrote the most perfect music of a contrapuntal kind that has ever been written. Long pieces for instruments were unknown, except in the form of suites, that is, different dances played one after the other. but Bach wrote several long works which were models of what could be done. One of the most famous of these is called the Italian Concerto, a work for the clavier in 3 movements. The first rhythmic and lively, the second slow and very beautiful, and the last quick and light. Another long work he wrote for the clavier, the Goldberg Variations, as they are called, was a wonderful set of variations on a theme, some very learned and some poetical and mysteriously beautiful. Bach also wrote beautiful suites. Some of the most beautiful are those now called the French suites, which were written in a little book of pieces he composed for his second wife. All his married life was very happy, and his second wife seems to have shared all his music. She sang, and he taught her to play, and she helped him copy his compositions. For in those days, engraving music was very expensive, and very little of Bach's work was published in his lifetime. Most of it exists in copies made by himself, his wife, his children, and his pupils. Bach engraved some of the works himself. Scarlatti and other composers had shown how to give instrumental music a shape by using a melody and repeating it, and Bach developed such ideas. But sometimes he used a little figure or group of notes all through a piece to give it unity. Sometimes he changed halfway through the piece to a different key and then back again to end in the original key. Such a proceeding was very modern in his day, and it was only fully developed and used by much later composers. But this form is in some of Bach's works, and he evidently understood many ways of giving shape and form to his pieces. We feel, as we hear his music, that it is inevitable in its feeling, and that the feeling underlying the sound makes the shape of the piece. Such shape was only possible with a man of such sincerity and force as Bach. An ordinary composer's music written in such a way would have seemed vague and meandering, but with Bach it seems like hearing one beauty lead to another, or as if a spirit were talking and revealing itself to us. So certain is it, and so full of meaning. One special form of composition is connected with the name of Bach, and Purcell and other composers also wrote beautiful examples of it, and that is a piece written on what is called a ground bass. This means that the same short passage or melody is used in the bass over and over again throughout the composition. It has proved to be a form that can underlie most moving, impressive music. Bach's chaconne is a famous example of it. It is always thought that Bach himself loved best the music that he wove round the choral tunes, for he was making a collection of his choral fantasies, his most personal and lovable music, when his last illness came. Bach's long, happy life came to an end in 1750. His eyes had probably suffered from his moonlight copying when a boy, for they were often troublesome, and at last he had an operation which was unfortunately useless. It left him blind, and for the first time in his life he felt ill and suffering. For some months he continued his work and dictated to his son-in-law a beautiful piece, fancy or fantasy as it is called, on a choral melody, Wenn wir in höchsten Nöten sind. It was his last work. Though Bach in his lifetime was revered as a wonderful performer on organ and clavier, and a wonderfully learned musician, it was not until many years later that his greatness as a composer was recognized. At last, early in the 19th century, his fame began with a better knowledge of his work. Mozart read everything he could by Bach. Beethoven called the 48 Preludes his musical Bible. Mendelssohn, Goethe, Schumann, all found in Bach inexhaustible beauties. And at last a society was founded called the Bach Gesellschaft to publish all that could be discovered of his work. A great deal had been lost, but all that was left was carefully collected and published by this society in 46 large volumes, the famous Bach Gesellschaft edition. While Bach was living his quiet, regular life, unconscious of much of his greatness, another great musician lived and worked in a very different way. Georg Friedrich Handel. Handel, 1685 to 1759, is especially well known to English people, for he lived a large part of his life in England and became a naturalized Englishman. His best-known oratorio, The Messiah, is like a national possession, so often do we hear it sung. But though Handel is best known because of his oratorios, they were only written at the end of his life, and the music which made him famous was almost all operas. These he poured out one after another. He would write one in a fortnight just in time to produce it, and then be hard at work on another. And all the time he paid visits, played at concerts and in private houses, traveled to collect singers to perform his work, and in fact did more than most men could have even attempted. Perhaps one of the things English people like most to remember about him, after his music, was his interest in the children of the Foundling Hospital. He gave a concert to raise money to finish the chapel there. He gave the organ to the chapel when it was finished. And every year after 1750, he gave a performance of the Messiah for the benefit of the hospital, and in this way helped it with thousands of pounds. Though blind for the last years of his life, he continued to direct these performances as usual, and on April 6, 1759, made his last public appearance in this way. After the performance, he felt very ill, and he died a few days later. Handel was born at Halle, where his father, an old man, was a barber surgeon. The father much disliked his son's feeling for music and opposed it in every possible way. But Handel managed to learn to play, and when he was 7 years old, he went with his father to the court of the Duke of Saxe-Weissenfels. The Duke heard him play the organ and persuaded his father to let him have a musical education. For many years, all his spare time was given to music, and he became celebrated for his organ playing and was made organist at the cathedral. But when he was 18 and his father had been dead for some years, he gave up his work in Halle and went to Hamburg. Hamburg was a great musical center in those days, for it was there that German opera was being produced. At this time, practically all opera was Italian. Operas were written in the Italian manner to Italian words and sung by Italian singers. But just as Lully had produced operas which were French in style, that is, less finished for the voice, but more dramatic and containing dances and rhythmic tunes which did not occur in Italian operas, so now a composer called Kaiser was producing German operas in Hamburg. These operas were founded on simple stories, and anyone interested in the development of opera naturally went to Hamburg. Handel went, therefore, to this famous musical center and managed to obtain an appointment as violinist in the opera house. In those days, the most important instrument in an opera orchestra was the harpsichord, and the performer who played the harpsichord also acted as the conductor. While playing, he led the other instruments, and he also had to play the accompaniments for recitatives and some other parts of the opera. Fortunately for Handel, the conductor was away on one occasion, and he had the opportunity to take his place. This led to his becoming known, and the operas he wrote were produced and made quite a success. It was not long after this that he went to Italy, where he had always longed to go, and there he made friends with all the great musicians of the day. He became the lifelong friend of Domenico Scarlatti. He met his father, Alessandro Scarlatti, and he knew Corelli the violinist well. The only great musician of the day whom he never met was Bach. 3 times Bach made special efforts to see Handel, but they were never successful. Once Bach went to Halle, but arrived a day too late. Once he sent his son, but all in vain. Handel's visit to Italy was like a triumphal tour. In Florence, after producing an opera, the Duke entertained him at his palace. In Venice, the theater was filled for every performance of his work, the audience shouting for the Saxon, as he was called. In Rome and Naples he stayed and wrote works which were produced with great success. This time in Italy had a wonderful effect on him. While he studied in Hamburg, he had learned to write good counterpoint, and he had always had a wonderful gift for melody. But in Italy, he learned to write with added grace his beautiful flowing melodies for single voices, tuneful, effective music. When we think of Handel, we hardly realize the perfect counterpoint of his famous choruses. What we all remember are his wonderful melodies. At last, in 1710, he came to London and began that series of operas which we hardly ever hear, but which contain tunes we all know: the Largo, the March in Scipio, which is still played by the Grenadier Guards, and many other famous marches and arias. Such dramatic, melodious works as he produced had never been heard or imagined before, and his success was tremendous. He lived for some time at Burlington House, Piccadilly, and for 2 years at Cannon's, a large country house near Edgware belonging to the Duke of Chandos. There he wrote his well-known suites for harpsichord, some of his best-known anthems, and 2 masques, Acis and Galatea, the other Haman and Mordecai. The second masque was really the Bible story of Esther, set to music and acted with scenery and costumes. Some years later, Handel proposed giving a public performance of this work, but there was a great outcry against a Bible story being acted, and the Bishop of London forbade the performance. Handel therefore produced this sacred play, lengthened and altered, but without any acting or scenery, and his audience was delighted. This was the first of Handel's oratorios, those great works which brought him even wider and more lasting fame than his operas had done. Handel worked very hard composing operas and controlling the various great singers who sang in them, settling their differences, rehearsing their songs, and conducting performances. It was no easy task to control the singers. Each was an important person, determined to have his or her full share of applause and jealous of the others. Quarrels between them were frequent and had to be settled, or the performance would have been ruined. Fashionable people courted them, applauded their favorites, paid large sums for seats to hear them, and even copied their dresses. And if any difficulty between the singers became public, it was at once intensified by the applause of their friends and the hisses of those who supported a rival. So there were constant difficulties to contend with. At one time there was a rival composer, Bononcini, whose supporters did their best to ruin Handel. At another time, rival entertainments stole his songs and even whole works. But he composed untiringly. He was a man of enormous physical strength, but it did not prevent his breaking down at last under the constant strain and excessive work. For 26 years he had produced operas, as well as writing anthems and music for many festive occasions. The sums of money he made at first, he lost at last. It seemed as if his successes were over, and his health impaired. He became partially paralyzed and had for a time to rest completely. And after this he wrote no more for the stage. Still, he did not give in, but devoted himself as soon as he could to writing oratorios. The few he had written were very popular and drew large audiences. Just as at first the king and royal family attended his operas, and society people fought their way into the crowded theater where they were produced, and paid large sums for a seat, so now they flocked to hear his oratorios. These oratorios had the special beauty of long and wonderful choruses. Such choruses were not possible in operas, which consisted mostly of airs and recitatives, but they were a great addition in Handel's oratorios. The Messiah, which is his best-known oratorio, was produced first in Dublin, and when it was given in London, the Hallelujah chorus so excited the audience, among whom was the king, that the people sprang to their feet and stood until it ended. Handel wrote his works with extraordinary speed. The Messiah was written in 24 days, and some of his operas in less time than that. He was one of the greatest masters of choral writing that ever lived, and some people find his the most beautiful music that ever has been written. The music of his operas is not like the music some composers write, communing as it were with themselves. It has other beauties, and at times magnificent effects of sound. Handel devoted all his amazing powers to writing worthy and beautiful music, so really effective that, as Mozart said of him, he can strike like a hammer when he chooses. Though Handel's fame rests on his operas and oratorios, he wrote as well a good deal of instrumental music, much of it very beautiful. His suites for piano and his violin and piano sonatas are lovely, and his works for organ and for the orchestra of his day show a richness and vigor most suitable to the instruments for which he writes and expressive of the force and power that underlay his character. His operas, though they are now hardly known, contain an enormous amount of lovely music, and they and his instrumental music deserve to be far better known than they are. Here is music that everyone could enjoy, and which is full of varied beauty. One other composer of this time has a special fame among English people. That is Dr. Thomas Arne, 1710 to 1778. His song, Rule Britannia, which is a national possession, he wrote at the end of a masque. Arne wrote the music to several masques and incidental music to some of Shakespeare's plays, and some of his settings of Shakespeare's songs are still famous. Everyone knows Where the Bee Sucks, and many people who have seen As You Like It have listened to Arne's music being sung to Under the Greenwood Tree and Blow, Blow, Thou Winter Wind. Arne was born near Covent Garden and was at school at Eton. He had no wish to enter the profession chosen for him by his father, and he managed to have a spinet carried secretly to his room. This he muffled, and on it he practiced. He also learnt to play the violin, and when leading the orchestra at a private house, was recognized by his father. But no persuasion would make him give up music, and his wish to pursue this art as a career was justified, for his lovely, graceful melodies soon made him famous. He wrote catches, glees, operas, oratorios, songs, and instrumental music, and he was engaged as composer at Drury Lane Theatre and at the popular Vauxhall Gardens and Ranelagh, and there still exist a large number of songs written by him for these open-air performances. Some of his instrumental music has great grace and charm, but it is by his songs that Arne will always be specially remembered. Arne wrote several glees, which are a kind of composition peculiar to England. Madrigal singing, which had been so loved by English people, had died out about 100 years before Arne was born, when music written in modes, not the usual modern scales, had died out. But the English love of part singing revived in a new form. Glees were compositions written for several solo voices, often only for men. Arne only wrote a few glees, and they were not his most important work. The best glees were written by other composers later, when the singing of glees was very popular, and clubs were formed where men could meet and join in this favorite pastime. The Catch Club was one of these reunions. It was formed in 1761 and was for singing glees as well as catches and rounds. Singing in canon, as it is called, was not part of a glee. Glees were longer, freer compositions, and very varied in character. The Glee Club was another reunion of this kind, started in 1783, and it became so well known for the excellence of its singing that important musicians who visited London sometimes attended its meetings. One of such visitors was Mendelssohn. The glees at these meetings were usually sung first by solo voices and then by a body of voices for each part, thus allowing all the members to join in. End of section 11 of Music by Ursula Creighton, read by Martha Weller, Champaign, Illinois, February 28, 2024.